How was the issue of slavery addressed between 1820 and 1850? With that question, we begin our next video lecture on the Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Law, history of and the role of the abolitionist movement, particularly with the Underground Railroad, and shifting the narrative in this country towards greater and greater support towards ending slavery. And I want you to remember that question because that is a question that is central to the greater question of what laid behind the origins of the Civil War. Two compromises I want you to keep in mind that preserved the question of slavery for a later date in the name of political compromise. 1820. If you remember clearly, Missouri wanted to enter the Union in 1820 as a slave state, being the second slave state to come out of the Louisiana Territory. To their surprise, the North objected. Why? Because this would give the South, the slave states, a two-senator advantage in the Senate. Two senators that they could use to perhaps protect or expand slavery as it existed. They reached a compromise. Rather than sitting down and discussing whether there should be a future for slavery in this country, in order to keep the Union together, they kicked the can down the road. They created Maine out of Massachusetts as a free state, allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state. We'll continue this pattern for the next 30 years. Slave state, free state, slave state, free state, so that no one has an advantage in the Senate. And they drew a line in the sand, 3630, stopping at what was then the newly independent country of Mexico. And they said anything north of this line, with the exception of Missouri, of course, any state that forms shall be a free state. And anything south of this line shall be a slave state. And as you can tell, this didn't give much room for expansion to the south. But other things are coming down the line. Texas, 1836. 1845, you get the Mexican-American War. 3 years later, delivers all of that territory you see there having belonged to Mexico to the United States. This compromise only lasts for 30 years. And then we get to the Compromise of 1850. And I'd like to read you from the textbook American History Connecting with the Past by Alan Brinkley, because I think it has, as far as I know, the best description of the narrative, the drama that went on in putting together the Compromise of 1850. A little background. It's 2 years after the end of the Mexican-American War, and California becomes the first state carved out of the Mexican cession that wants to become a state. Only 2 years after having once belonged to Mexico. What's behind this? The gold rush. The gold rush, the gold discovered in 1848 is going to cause a flood of people to California in a very short period of time, both from the east as well as from China, by the way. Enough so that they could qualify to petition Congress for consideration for statehood. However, they wish to join the Union as a free state. In this case, the South objects, because now the free states would have a two-senator advantage in the Senate. And frankly, the South has nothing to counter California's entry. Faced with this mounting crisis, moderates and Unionists spent the winter of 1849 and 1850 trying to frame a great compromise. The aging Henry Clay, who was spearheading the effort, believed that no compromise could last unless it settled all of the issues in dispute between the sections. As a result, he took several measures that had been proposed separately. combined them into a single piece of legislation, and presented it to the Senate on January 29, 1850. Among the bill's provisions were the admission of California as a free state, the formation of territorial governments in the rest of the lands acquired from Mexico without restrictions on slavery, the abolition of the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia, and a new and more effective fugitive slave law. These resolutions launched a debate that raged for 7 months, both in Congress and throughout the nation. The debate occurred in 2 phases, the differences between which revealed much about how American politics was changing in the 1850s. In the first phase of the debate, the dominant voices in Congress were those of old men, national leaders who still remembered Jefferson, Adams, and other founders, who argued for or against the compromise on the basis of broad ideals. Clay himself, 73 years old in 1850, appealed to shared national sentiments of nationalism. Early in March, another of the old leaders, John C. Calhoun, 68 years old and so ill that he had to sit grimly in his seat while a colleague read the speech for him, joined the debate. He insisted that the North grant the South equal rights in the territories, that it agree to observe the laws concerning fugitive slaves, that it cease attacking slavery, and that it amend the Constitution to create dual presidents, one from the North and one from the South, each with a veto. Calhoun was making radical demands that had no chance of passage, but like Clay, he was offering what he considered a comprehensive, permanent solution to the sectional problem that would, he believed, save the Union. After Calhoun came the third of the elder statesmen, 68-year-old Daniel Webster, one of the great orators of his time. Still nourishing presidential ambitions, he delivered an eloquent address in the Senate, trying to rally Northern moderates to support Clay's compromise. But in July, after 6 months of this impassioned nationalistic debate, Congress defeated the Clay proposal. And with that, the controversy moved to its second phase, in which a very different cast of characters predominated. Clay, ill and tired, left Washington to spend the summer resting in the mountains. Calhoun had died even before the vote in July, and Webster accepted a new appointment as Secretary of State, thus removing himself from the Senate and from the debate. In place of these leaders, a new, younger group now emerged. One spokesman was William H. Seward of New York, 49 years old, a wily political operator who staunchly opposed the proposed compromise. The ideals of union were to him less important than the issue of eliminating slavery. Another was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, 42 years old, a representative of the new Cotton South. To him, the slavery issue was less one of principles and ideals than one of economic self-interest. Most important of all, there was Stephen A. Douglas, a 37-year-old Democratic senator from Illinois, a Westerner from a rapidly growing state. He was an open spokesman for the economic needs of his section and especially for the construction of railroads. He was a career devoted not to any broad national goals, but to the sectional gain and personal self-promotion. The new leaders of the Senate were able, as the old leaders had not been, to produce a compromise. One spur in the compromise was the disappearance of the most powerful obstacle to it, the president. Zachary Taylor had been adamant that only after California and possibly New Mexico were admitted as states could other measures be discussed. But on July 9, 1850, Taylor suddenly died, the victim of a violent stomach disorder. He was succeeded by Millard Fillmore of New York, a tall, handsome, dignified man who understood the political importance of flexibility. He supported the compromise and used his powers of persuasion to swing northern states into line. The new leaders also benefited from their own pragmatic tactics. Douglas's first step after the departure of Clay was to break up the omnibus bill that Clay had envisioned as a great comprehensive solution to the sectional crisis, and to introduce instead a series of separate measures to be voted on one by one. Thus, representatives of different sections could support those elements of the compromise they liked and oppose those they did not. Douglas also gained support with complicated backroom deals linking the compromise to such non-ideological matters as the sale of government bonds and the construction of railroads. As a result of his efforts, by mid-September, Congress had acted and the president had signed all the components of the bill, of the compromise. The Compromise of 1850, unlike the Missouri Compromise 30 years earlier, was not a product of widespread agreement on common national ideals. It was rather a victory of bargaining and self-interest. Still, members of Congress hailed the measure as a triumph of statesmanship, and Millard Fillmore, signing it, called it just a just settlement of the sectional problem. And this is what happened in the end. This is what they got out of it. California would be admitted as a free state. Slavery would be abolished in Washington, D.C., the slave trade, that is. As far as Utah Territory and New Mexico's territory, slavery could be possible, but that would be up to the people when there was enough people to live there to form a territorial government. This is kind of the beginning of the concept of popular sovereignty, but not quite, not yet. And in return, the South got the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law that would allow slave owners to retrieve runaway slaves that had run away to the north. There had been a law before, but it didn't have any teeth. It depended on local authorities enforcing it. This new law was going to put authority in the hands of federal marshals, helping slave catchers going into the north to retrieve slaves. Thus began the infamous history of the Fugitive Slave Act, in which you can see, ads for runaway slaves were not an uncommon thing. They were found all over the north. But for years, slaves made their way to the north. White northerners that were not particularly, didn't have a problem with free blacks, would ignore these ads for the most part. But with the Fugitive Slave Act, everything changes. I like to read out of Charles Beard's American History. Charles Beard was perhaps the early 20th century's most prominent American historian, and how he describes the effect of the Fugitive Slave Act, particularly on Northerners. The promise was more difficult to fulfill than to utter. In fact, the vigorous execution of one measure included in the compromise, the Fugitive Slave Law, only made matters worse. Designed as security for the planters, it proved a powerful instrument in their undoing. Slavery 500 miles away on a Louisiana plantation was so remote from the north that only the strongest imagination could maintain a constant rage against it. Slave catching, manhunting by federal officers on the streets of Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Chicago, or Milwaukee, and in the hamlets and villages of the wide-stretching farmlands of the north, that was another matter. It brought the most odious aspects of slavery home to thousands of men and women who would have otherwise been indifferent to the system. Law-abiding businessmen, mechanics, farmers, and women, when they saw peaceful Negroes who had resided in their neighborhoods for years torn away by federal officers and carried back to bondage, were transformed into enemies of the law. They helped slaves to escape. They snatched them away from officers who had captured them. They broke open jails and carried fugitives off to Canada. Assistance to runaway slaves, always more or less common in the North, was by this time organized into a system. If the Fugitive Slave Act succeeded in doing anything, was agitate Northerners and bring them closer and closer to the abolitionist cause and further normalize the abolitionist cause. You can see a sign warning the people of Boston not to cooperate with the authorities. This was the outrageous demand put on Northerners, that now, at risk of breaking federal law yourself, you were being put in a position to collaborate and cooperate with an act that you would find morally repugnant, wrong, to your sense of ethics, and yet, under penalty of law, you were put in a position to cooperate. If anything incensed Northerners, it was that. And, efforts to organize, efforts to bring awareness to Northerners to not cooperate with the authorities were met, with repression and brutality by the authorities. The abolitionist movement was no stranger to this sort of reaction. So exactly what was the problem? Why ask for a Fugitive Slave Act? The Fugitive Slave Act was in itself an admission that the South had a problem with fugitive slaves. And the fact that the South had a problem with fugitive slaves was another admission that their version of slavery, the propaganda that they had worked on for years, trying to promote this false narrative that slavery was good, that it was justified in the Bible, that it was, in their terms, a positive good for those enslaved, okay, was false. People do not flee a system that is benevolent. People do not flee a system that, in the words of the South, is a positive good. And how did they flee? I'm sure all of you have heard of this before. And this was a product of the abolitionist movement. They're the ones that put this together. It was called the Underground Railroad. No, it was not actually underground. And no, it was not actually a railroad, although they used terminology that was found in the railroad industry. And for 10 years, through a complex network of secret trails and roads and passages, safe houses, they were able to smuggle over 100,000 slaves out of the South and into freedom. And every slave that left the South was wealth that was leaving the South. The slave owners, this is more complex than just a slave owner. Quite often, slave owners would insure their assets with an insurance company. They would underwrite their slaves. If they were bondholders, investors, they were partial owners and collected dividends on, the labor of slaves, there were insurance companies that insured these assets. And every slave that ran away was a claim they had to pay out. So yes, those insurance companies and the investors that were invested in this, in slavery, and the slave owners, they took an economic hit every time somebody left, because to them it was an asset. And they were the ones behind pressuring Washington for a Fugitive Slave Act. But consider what that act actually meant. If we look at this map, there were various ways that the abolitionists organized the escape out of the South. It really had to do with where you lived. And keep in mind, a lot of the work is being done by abolitionists that live in the South. Abolitionists already put themselves in a position of being marginalized at best or attacked at worst by the general population. When they began as a movement in the 1830s, if we're going to put it as, they spent the 1830s and 40s pretty much quite despised and marginalized by, public opinion. So imagine a Southern abolitionist that held on to views that were anti-slavery, living in a region of the country where everyone around them saw things entirely different, and they put themselves at great risk. So, if you were a slave in southern Georgia, the way out was Florida. Maybe among the Seminoles that they would take you in. The Seminoles did have that tradition of doing so and allowing escaped slaves into their tribe. Or to the Bahamas, a British territory that no longer practiced slavery since 1807. If you were in Texas, make it to Mexico. Mexico did not allow for slavery. And over time, the slaves that escaped into Mexico would melt into the Mexican population. The Mississippi River. Follow the Mississippi River. That was a way out of the country. If you went north, following the Mississippi River, and eventually to Canada. And that was the thing. You had to make it to Canada. After the Fugitive Slave Law, simply being in the North was not enough, because the slave catchers and the federal marshals, they were going to Chicago and Boston and New York. If you were a slave in the Southeast along the seaboard, um, that was your way out. Okay, paths in the woods, through swamps to throw off the scent of dogs. Safe houses along the way. People volunteered their homes. They would put a lantern in the front porch to let people know, which they always traveled at night, by the way, that to avoid the slave patrol and the dogs, that you could rest here until the morning. We will hide you. And thanks to this network of safe houses and volunteers, they called themselves conductors. They would guide groups of slaves, up the Underground Railroad to freedom. Like I said before, 100,000 or 2.5 of the South's slave population, 2.5%, made their way to freedom. And just like many made their freedom, many failed, many were caught. Okay, and the consequences were dire. The Fugitive Slave Act created the Underground Railroad. It ushered in the period of runaways and slave catchers. And slave catchers was one of those jobs that were available to poor whites, and they defended them tooth and nail because it meant a livelihood for themselves and their family. And yet, that's what they dedicated themselves to, finding people that no longer wanted to live in bondage and returning them. There were human traffickers then, just like there are today. And like I said, the consequences were dire. Let's go through some of these images. Whipping, of course, so that's a famous picture the abolitionists used to take around to their lectures to quell any nonsense beliefs that slavery wasn't that bad. Amputation, hobbling, branding, or the infamous collar, sometimes with bells at the end of the spokes and sometimes without. That would be strapped to an attempted escapee's neck to make sure they would not be found. And the slave catchers were going into the cities of the North to capture escaped slaves. Slave patrol was observing all the main roads and trails throughout the South. And this is a little controversial, but I want you to pay attention to that badge there. Okay? I'm not, it's not a historical falsehood. Law enforcement, as we know it, particularly in the southern part of the United States, has its historical roots in the slave patrols of the antebellum South. Even the use of the star would one day be used by particularly sheriff's departments throughout the star. There is that historical lineage between one group, historical group, and its contemporary form. And of the most famous conductors, we have Harriet Tubman. And as you may well know, Harriet Tubman herself was a slave. She escaped from slavery, but was not content until more people were free from slavery, and she would make it into the South many times in her lifetime to escort people to freedom. They claim that she escorted over 300 slaves, family members of hers, friends, and strangers, to freedom in the North. And so she was one of the most active conductors in the Underground Railroad. During the war, she would be a spy for the Union. And who was behind all of this? Who were the abolitionists? Like I said, abolition has an interesting history in this country's history, if you will, be redundant. Um, just like there were people that supported slavery and practiced slavery, there were people that opposed slavery on many grounds, philosophical, religious. In the beginning, folks that were anti-slavery were not necessarily abolitionists, by the way. They opposed slavery usually on moral grounds or religious grounds, quite often pointing at Scripture as justification for their beliefs. However, their approach was gradual and pacifist. They did not agree in the use of violence to reach their goals. They did agree in persuasion, attempting to persuade the other side of the country as to the harm that slavery caused. That was the narrative that was common, in the early 1800s. Okay, the idea that slavery was harmful to the soul, it was harmful to one's sense of morals. It wasn't the blacks that were being harmed, it was the whites harming their spiritual health by practicing slavery. And they should eliminate slavery from the country for that purpose. The early opponents of slavery suggested a number of ways of doing this, either by limiting and ending importation with the idea that the existing population would shrink and so would slavery and eventually fade away, or colonization. One of the earliest organizations that opposed slavery was the American Colonization Society. Their solution was to take slaves and send them back to Africa, believing that once we remove black people from the country, then that source of dispute and hatred between white Americans would disappear. But that in itself was an absurd idea. When you're talking about removing people from this country, many had been here for over 200 years. You could trace their lineage back to the earliest black people in this country, back to the 1600s, and send them to a continent that the only thing they have in common with the people living there is their skin color, nothing else. Free blacks opposed the idea of colonization. Abraham Lincoln, as far as the late 1850s, continued to, flirt with the idea until he was convinced otherwise by Frederick Douglass. But in the end, it was too expensive. It was a ridiculously expensive venture. Liberia was the one experiment, and I think Liberia is what woke him up that this is not realistic when you're talking about millions of people. Nor is it correct, nor is it right. Then comes William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison is going to shift the narrative. He's going to take the abolitionist narrative from a gradual, pacifist, let's rely on persuasion approach to a more activist, more assertive approach towards ending slavery. And William Garrison is he's one of the early, I know there's a lot of opinions about this term, but one of the earliest social justice warriors in this country's history. A proud, founder in this country's history of dissent and protest, and even reform, if you want to call it that. William Lloyd Garrison makes his name by changing the narrative. Slavery doesn't harm white people, it harms black people, and he's trying to get people to see it that way. You are harming others. He rejects gradualism. He calls for the immediate abolition of slaves with no compensation for slave owners. And not only that, once slavery is done, he calls for the immediate extension of all rights to every black person in this country. And this is a substantial change to what the abolitionists were suggesting up until that moment. By comparison, Garrison is a radical, and proudly so. In 1831, he founds the newspaper The Liberator, that's for years the most widely read abolitionist paper in the country. The following year, he founds the American Anti-Slavery Society, which again is going to be the dominant abolitionist group in this country. And he's doing this in a time in this period where he and his followers are outright despised, marginalized, cast aside as marginal people who are a threat to the social order. But the man is persistent. He's going to see it through. And eventually, black abolitionists are going to come into the picture as well. Take Boston-born David Walker. David Walker writes a pamphlet which describes his somewhat different approach that William Garrison. David Walker believes that the only way that the slave is going to be emancipated is through violence. Peaceful means are going to be a waste of time. And it may seem like, wow, well, you're being unnecessarily extreme. By the time we get to the 1850s, there's a whole lot of people that are thinking just like David Walker. In David Walker's appeal to the colored people, to the colored citizens, he declares that America is more our country than it is the whites. We have enriched it with our blood and tears. The whites want slaves and want us for their slaves, but some of them will curse the day they ever saw us. Slaves should be, he declared, cut their masters' throats, should kill or be killed. Needless to say, at the time that he wrote this upset a lot of white people. David Walker, at 33 years old, was found dead in an alleyway. Some speculated it might have been angry whites in reaction to his pamphlet. Others, probably more correctly, speculated that it was likely tuberculosis, the same tuberculosis that took his daughter's life earlier. And then comes Frederick Douglass, who is going to be a towering figure and eventually is going to be the central figure in the abolitionist movement as we go into the 1850s and 1860s. He himself was an escaped slave, incredibly intelligent, talented, a natural orator, if you will. He escapes to Europe, he goes off to Europe for a while, he comes back, and he joins the abolitionist cause. And he travels around as a lecturer, lecturing for abolition. He writes a book of memoirs in 1845, basically a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He finds a paper the following year, the North Star, in 1846. His audience are free blacks in the North that are being drawn towards the abolitionist cause. Unlike Walker, he sees violence as maybe not the best way to move forward. Like Garrison, he would like to see the immediate emancipation of slavery, but he is not afraid to make assertive comments, comments that might actually make people uncomfortable. For example, in 1854, on the 4th of July, he wrote a well-known essay reflecting on what the 4th of July means to a black man in the United States. And I quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all the days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour." He can be just as provocative as Garrison or Walker. And over time, he and Garrison join forces and bring black abolitionists and white abolitionists together, and in doing so produce feats of history like the Underground Railroad. There were also women in this picture. Take Sojourner Truth, for example. Very interesting person. An escaped slave. Dutch was her first language, by the way. An escaped slave. She lived in a religious commune throughout most of the 1850s, maybe? I think that might be. Before the 1850s in New York. She emerges as a lecturer. Okay, that was the thing, would lecture in lecture halls to people that were willing to. This is how they spread awareness about abolition. But the thing about her, and she became famous because in 1851 she wrote a pamphlet based on a speech of hers called "Ain't I a Woman?" And she not only becomes a leading voice in the abolitionist community, she becomes a leading voice in the early women's rights movement. Okay, she becomes an advocate of not just rights for blacks, but rights for women too. And she's part of that Seneca Falls, Susan B. Anthony generation of trying to tie women's rights to the emancipation of slaves and abolition in general. So that's Sojourner Truth. The abolitionist movement is picking up steam. it's less and less marginal as we go into the 1850s. More and more people are starting to come around. You have to understand that for decades, American Northerners, in many cases, didn't know better. They took what Southern propagandists and apologists were painting as the reality of slavery for granted. They had never been there. They never met a black person. They tell me that it's a big happy family, that it's a benevolent practice, that it's not that bad. I'm going to believe it. It's the abolitionists that start to change that narrative. Okay? And then they go big. 1852. Harriet Beecham Stowe writes a best-selling novel based on her childhood memoirs. It's called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And this just blows the doors off the hinges when it comes to Southern apologists trying to justify slavery, because she paints a very sentimental and yet a very, very dark picture of the realities of slavery, and they're based on things that she observed when she was young. Becomes an absolute bestseller. Mind you, there's only 30 million Americans in the country, and it sells 1 million copies in the first year. It's translated into just about every language. Okay? Many credit her, I don't know how accurate this is, with really getting the North to start looking at the abolitionist movement as not marginal, but actually something that should be admired. Lincoln, when he meets Harriet Beecham Stowe, he actually tells her hyperbolically, "So you're the lady that started this war." Some people had to have, linking it to her, and the incredible effect that she had on public opinion in the North. Only a year after her, it didn't sell as it was not a bestseller, but Solomon Northrup, who dedicates his book to Harriet Beecham Stowe, writes his memoirs, 12 Years a Slave, which describe how he was kidnapped in 1841 in Washington, D.C., and sold into slavery, a free black, and managed to escape in 1853. And this added fuel to the fire was yet another narrative, another story that was reshaping how Northerners understood slavery. And likewise, the South. And all of these things were coming together to drive the sectional wedge even further. We'll continue next time.